เป็นการแสดงปาฐกถาค่ะในมิติของ Co-Create Innovation นะคะโดยดร. จอห์น เอ. สวีนีย์ค่ะ Transformative Foresight Lead นะคะ School of International Future และก็ยังเป็น UNESCO Chair นะคะ in Anticipatory Governance and Sustainable Policy Making ค่ะซึ่งวันนี้นะคะดร. จอห์นท่านติดภารกิจที่ยุโรปนะคะแต่ว่าท่านมีความประสงค์ที่อยากจะแบ่งปันประสบการณ์ทำงานนะคะที่สามารถนำกระบวนการคาดการณ์อนาคตไปสร้างการมีส่วนร่วมขับเคลื่อนให้เกิดการเปลี่ยนแปลงทางสังคมได้จริงในพื้นที่ต่างๆทั่วโลกนะคะโดยท่านก็ได้สละเวลานะคะในการจัดเตรียมเนื้อหาบรรยายมาผ่านทางวิดีโอแทนนะคะขอเชิญทุกท่านค่ะรับฟังปาฐกถาจากดร. จอห์น เอ. สวีนีย์ค่ะขอเชิญค่ะ
เรียนเชิญครับ
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. John A. Sweeney. I'm the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies for Anticipatory Governance and Sustainable Policy Making at Westminster International University in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. I wish that I could be with you, but I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit about some of my work and my research, and actually some of my learnings in using scenarios. And so I have one case study that I'd like to share with you, and some insights and reflections on the art and science of futures and foresight. I'll start off by saying that there are many definitions of what scenarios are and what they're supposed to do. This is a definition that I have been developing over the past few years and that I use in my consulting and my research. I think scenarios ultimately are stories about the future. And of course, there are lots of stories about the future, whether there's data from government or a projection or a plan or science fiction or even any range of TV or media. So there can be lots of different stories about the future, but this is intentionally a story that is about the future that created specifically to challenge our thinking and ultimately to help us learn. And this is where I think scenarios are quite unique. I think scenarios, when done well, do have the opportunity to shift thinking, to challenge mental models, to eliminate biases, to highlight blind spots, and to call attention to the assumptions that we have when thinking about the future. Of course, all of that's necessary if in fact we're going to learn, and then of course, try to create change or take action based on those insights. So let me tell you a little bit about the case of Hawaii 2060. This was a project that I had a chance to work on very early in my career, so it really shaped my thinking about scenarios and about futures and foresight in general. I was a graduate research assistant at the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, which is also where I did my PhD with a focus in futures at the University of Hawaii. We were working with the State Office of Planning, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So both state level and national level, as well as expert stakeholders to look at the future of Hawaii and specifically what climate change was going to do to the islands over the next 50 years and what were some possible, probable, and even preferable futures. And this is really important because, of course, Hawaii, as an island chain in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, is quite vulnerable to the effects of climate change, specifically coastal erosion, extreme weather events, sea level rise, and rising oceanic acidity. I would also note, of course, that these challenges also, I think, are felt specifically in Thailand. And of course, we're seeing more extreme weather events, just like the heat waves that, of course, created lots of challenges very recently. Now, why actually use futures and foresight? If the climate data is quite good, why do we actually need to do this? Well, what we found was that the data wasn't really enough. So they reached out to our research center and said, look, we need to go beyond the models. We need to expand horizons of thought, and we really need to stretch people's thinking beyond just the plausible, but to focus on the possible, what we think is likely or probable, and then also to bring out what's preferable and to use scenarios to be able to do that. Of course, we're thinking about the future in the sense of what could it actually be like, so there's an element of forecasting here, but we're also really leaning into the idea of alternative futures, actually thinking about possibilities for the future that are quite different, and I'll talk more about that in just a bit. So the alternative futures that we created, or the scenarios that we created, were based on expert interviews, research, and we used an archetypal approach to modeling scenarios that very much focused on what was possible. I think that's really important because these scenarios were not meant to be forecast, even though aspects of them were brought about and ultimately were the result of forecasting. They were ultimately meant to be 4 different perspectives on what the future can and might be. Now, in our research, we found some very interesting things. Of course, we went to the university, given that it has one of the most well-regarded school of oceanic and earth science technologies in the world, and we received data from them. And what we found was that by 2050, we could expect about 1/3 of a meter of sea level rise, and by 2100, possibly as much as a meter. Now, what we were told specifically was that it is actually possible that these figures may increase on further research. And you'll see in the bottom right what actually this means for the island, and this is the main island of Oahu, and pictured in the top left is one of the main urban cores of the island, which is Waikiki, part of the center of the city of Honolulu. And I think similar to places I've been in Thailand, where you have a lot of urban density, you have it very close to a range of different water, whether it's directly on the water or canal. And so the question becomes, of course, what is possible? What's even preferable given the potentiality for pretty dramatic sea level rise? Now, archetypal futures are quite different from other scenario approaches, and I wanted to go through these specifically because these really did shape ultimately the conversations that we had with the different participants. And the best way, or one way that I describe this, is imagine that you're putting ideas or you're putting something into each of these different cups. What's going to happen is, and this is what liquid does, is it takes the shape of the cup. So each archetype is a different shape. It's not that it's ultimately the result of one particular force or 2 particular forces. It's ultimately been designed from a particular, again, perspective to have a particular shape. And ultimately, the approach that we used was created actually by Jim Dager, who was the director at the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies for about 40 years. He was also my PhD advisor and really one of the founders of the fields of futurism foresight. So the first future that we worked with, and actually the future that I was actually in charge of, was continued growth. This is the official future, this is the extended present future. It's not a baseline scenario, but really it's about everything that we see happening today, but a more extreme version. So it's not just sort of continued growth in the sense of economy is growing and everything's okay, but actually maybe if we see inequality that's growing, maybe climate change is growing. So the idea is, imagine if we hit fast forward on everything, what ultimately could happen in the future. And so you see the graphic here of things accelerating, things really evolving rapidly. That's really at the heart of continued growth. Now the second idea is, what if we pause growth? What if we decide to pull back? What if we stop growth? What if we become disciplined? Or, of course, people talk about sustainability. Now this can go lots of different ways. Maybe it ends up in a real dictatorship, a real authoritarian approach. Or maybe it's like Disneyland, where things are controlled, but we don't really feel it or see it. There's surveillance, there's monitoring, there are rules, but you really don't live with this feeling of that things are being very tightly controlled. The idea of discipline is that you want to pull back and restrain growth specifically so you don't have a collapse. And that's what the New Beginnings is all about. There's been a collapse, and now we're having to start over. So this is a post-collapse, starting a new archetype. And of course, there's no shortage of this in film and media, but of course, lots of people also working on these scenarios in relation to fears over climate change, or even fears even more recently about AI. And of course, speaking of technology and the potential for it to be transformative, the last archetype is transformation. This is a completely new paradigm. This is a new type of growth curve or a new direction. So it's not just continued growth in the sense of moving from something that we had before, but really a new actual creation of something different, right? It's a real radical shift. And that can be driven by technology, or it can be driven by society, culture, religion. So the idea of a spiritual renaissance. The idea is it doesn't have to be just technological transformation, but transformation through other means. So those were the approaches that we took. And all of our research and all the data that we found was put into those 4 perspectives. And we modeled and created stories about what Hawaii could be like in the year 2060 based on this. Now, very important about this particular approach, Jim Dater, pictured here, who is the creator of this method, says, each of the alternatives has good and bad features. So there's going to be winners and losers. None of them should be considered either a good or a bad future per se. Most people, of course, like transformation. Most people don't want to start over. So we do have our biases, we do have our assumptions. And this is also really interesting, is that the perspective that we should take is that in the long run, all 4 of these generic forms, these archetypes, have equal probabilities of happening, and of course, need to all be considered in equal measure and sincerity, which means we shouldn't let our bias or our prejudice or our assumptions about one or any of these sort of allow us to dismiss any of the others, and I'll talk about why that's important. So the approach that we took, of course, was not just using alternative features and scenarios, but making them experiential. So there were 4 rooms at the Waikiki Marriott Hotel, and when you walked into one of those rooms, you were in the year 2060. So I was actually curating a board meeting from a corporation that was very powerful and essentially was the government operating the state of Hawaii, but also around the world. And so that was the continued growth scenario that I was in. But I want to talk about another scenario. This is the transformation scenario, because something very interesting happened in this particular room. In this session, one of the participants said, I'm sorry, this is too much, right? And what he really was responding to was we had a scenario where there was dramatic sea level rise. And we saw this based on the data and the information that we had. We modeled that to 2060, and we said, okay, well, if there's a lot of really radical technology, maybe people actually go from living on land above the sea to living under the sea. And this is what we see pictured here on the left. So if we see dramatic coastal erosion, if we see dramatic sea level rise, maybe there's a move to actually create a blue economy. Focus on, let's say, harvesting algae and kelp for food. Maybe we shift to mining the seabed floor. Maybe we actually produce energy using OTEC or solar. So really trying to create a really new paradigm. This is what a transformational future really is meant to be. And I'll say ultimately that we had success. We had success because in 2012, there was actual policy change. So there was a bill that was signed into law that included the perspective of future generations. Now this is quite popular, but in 2012, actually this was quite innovative. And ultimately it said that we need to take into consideration the impacts of climate change and avoid, minimize, or mitigate loss of life, land, and property of future generations. Of course, now there's been a lot of interest in intergenerational justice, intergenerational perspectives, bringing that into policy planning strategy processes. But at the time, this was some of the most aggressive shifts. And this actually was a change in the state planning guidelines. So really trying to mainstream foresight and to try to bring that future generation perspective into the policy process and conversation. So yes, 100% it was a success. But I want to talk about another part. And this really happened during that transformational scenario. One of the world's leading oceanographers, in fact, one of the top scientists that we actually interviewed for the project, stepped into the room, heard the presentation, and said, I'm sorry, this is unrealistic, irresponsible, and implausible. And he actually went to our mentor and advisor, Jim Dater, who was there on site helping us coordinate, and told him this. And of course, when we heard the news, we were all a little bit concerned. But Jim said, don't worry, it's okay. Some people, react this way. And he was a little bit concerned because he thought that the level of sea level rise that we had was too high. We explained, of course, it was a scenario. It wasn't a prediction or a forecast. It was meant to be a provocation. It was meant to stretch people's thinking. What if this were to happen? What, in fact, would we do? Now, that happened in 2011. Fast forward 3 years. In 3 years, new research was released. That new research found that sea level rise was now expected to be closer to 3 meters, not 1 meter. And so this unstoppable sea level rise due to glacial collapse completely changed the conversation. And that was in May 2014. Later that summer, there was an actual follow-up event, and that same scientist came forward and said, you know what? I was wrong. I'm so sorry. And this happened really early in my career, and it really shaped my thinking and also shaped, I think, how I approach scenarios. And why I wanted to share this was, I imagined this moment and said, what would be different if we had had that person in the room and we hadn't lost 3 years? What could have changed, right? So I think from my perspective, the real learning here is, how do we create spaces that challenge people's thinking, but not alienate people, not shut people down? And so scenarios can help us stretch our thinking, but we have to stretch ourselves. We have to be open to thinking differently. So I really think it's important that we have to contextualize, we have to prepare participants, we have to ensure when we're doing these processes that we understand who our audience is, and we ultimately speak to them in a way that connects with them, but also challenges them. And this is where I think very much that futures as a practice and ultimately foresight is the art of anticipation based, it should be, sorry, based on the science of exploration. So in between art and science is craft, which is to say that we have to find a way to practice futures using this art and science. And so I think using scenarios to create a resilient future will require both art and science. The craft of creating stories that can challenge thinking and create learning must be driven by local voices. And I think this is really important because it's local perspectives that can really speak to and bring out and create that empathy with regard to how we might be able to think and ultimately feel differently about the future. And most importantly, as my mentor and advisor, Jim Dater, always says, we also have to reinforce the idea and ultimately make it normal to accept that any useful idea about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. Which is to say, and of course, if we look back at the last 3 years or the last year, no shortage of surprises, no shortage of uncertainty, but are we now, even though things might feel like they're getting back to normal, are we really now investing in thinking about and bringing forward what seems ridiculous? Because of course, we don't want to be in a position where the unthinkable becomes the unavoidable and we haven't invested in thinking about it. The last thing I'll mention here is you see the asterisk. Of course, not all ridiculous ideas are useful. And this is where we need the art and the science, we need the practice and the craft to ultimately come forward to ensure that we're creating experiences, that we're building stories about the future that can connect with people, but that can also challenge them in ways that hopefully are productive and creative. So thank you so much. Again, I really wish that I could be with you. It's a pleasure to be able to share a little bit, and good luck, and I hope you have a successful conference. Thank you so much.
ขอบคุณสำหรับข้อมูลที่น่าสนใจมากๆนะครับของดร.สวีนีนะครับผม